Welcome to Know Your Rights. Today, we are about to introduce you the emerging topic of transitional justice as we go through a past conflict era here in Sri Lanka. In order to do that, we have here today Mr. Patrick Burgess, who is the co-founder and president of Asia Justice and Rights, an international non-profit human rights organization based in Jakarta, Indonesia. He's an Australian barrister and trial counsel, having appeared in many criminal trials and appellate matters in Australian courts. Patrick has worked in an advisory capacity on human rights issues in various countries such as Afghanistan, Burundi, Rwanda, Cambodia, Bangladesh, Nepal, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Burma, Vietnam, and Timor, to name a few. He has also been a senior member of the Australian Refugee Review Tribunal and was the Asia Director for the International Centre for Transitional Justice. He is a recognized international expert and a trainer on post-conflict issues, transitional justice, legal aid, and human rights. Welcome to Know Your Rights, Patrick.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here.
Okay, so let me begin with asking, what is transitional justice in simple terms?
That's actually a good question because the term is used widely now, and yet I find when I travel and work in various post-conflict situations, most people don't really understand what that term means. They think it means half justice, transitional justice, or less than justice. But actually the term is a broad term, and it has developed to cover all of the mechanisms and approaches that a society undertakes to deal with a history of mass violations. So once a country or a community, they have experienced mass crimes, mass torture, killing, and rape, and they're trying to recover from that and make sure that it doesn't happen again, they can design a whole range of responses to what has happened in the past. And all of those responses are actually included in the term transitional justice. And the United Nations acknowledges that definition in general, that it covers all of the things that a country may do to deal with the mass violations.
Right. So could you please give us some examples of some scenarios where the need to transitional justice has arisen?
There are, in fact, I think it's probably every country in the world has had a history of mass violations. It's part of our evolution, coming out of a historical violence, historical mistreatment. We are, I believe, in a trajectory forward. We're moving towards situations where those mass crimes are less likely to take place. It's a very slow, unsteady process. And we often work in transitional situations where there have been mass crimes, dictatorships, wars, and then they're transitioning to peace and democracy. There are many countries in Latin America, El Salvador, Guatemala, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, who went through a transition and have used various transitional justice mechanisms to deal with it. In Africa, we know South Africa, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Chad, Kenya have all had their own transitional justice mechanisms. And in Asia, we also have a court in Cambodia, there was a court in Jakarta, one in East Timor, in Bangladesh, in Truth Commission in Thailand, in Timor, various other places. So there are many, many examples of countries which have used a transitional justice approach to deal with the mass violations. It's always difficult.
Yes.
It's always partial success. But I think that it is a useful approach. Okay.
Could you explain the 4 pillars of transitional justice?
Okay. I mean, as I said, there are a broad range of things that can be done in order to deal with mass violations. And after a conflict or dictatorship, there's so much to do. I mean, we want to rebuild the courts and often the police or the schools, the medical facilities, the taxation system, lots of things have been broken. History has taught us that we also need to deal with those violations. We just can't leave them unanswered because what we find are that they tend to repeat themselves. And the countries which have experienced conflict re-experience conflict over and over again, and those who deal with it and face it head on and try to deal with it have a better chance of breaking that cycle. And so what has been developed, and there's no magic in this, but there is an approach, a transitional justice framework, which has 4 general pillars to it. And I think those 4 areas in many ways just help us to remember the different approaches that we can take when we're designing what we need to do to address mass crimes and violations and make sure they don't happen again. So those 4 pillars are criminal justice, or prosecutions, or accountability first. The second one is seeking and sharing the truth of what happened. The third one is to repair, to help repair the lives of victims, often called reparations.
Okay.
And the fourth one is all the range of reform that we can undertake in order to guarantee that the violations won't recur. The United Nations calls that guarantees of non-repetition.
Yes.
And we can remember it largely deals with reform. So those are the 4 pillars.
Okay. So let's begin with the truth-seeking, or the right to know. What does it involve?
Okay. I mean, one thing to remember about those 4 pillars of transitional justice: criminal justice, truth, reparations, and guarantees of non-repetition, is that no society can find a solution with just one of those pillars.
Yes.
That there needs to be an approach that includes all of them.
Yes.
And that should be a holistic approach, and it should be sequenced according to your needs. Some societies might begin with reparations for victims, seeking the truth. It may or may not be possible to prosecute those most responsible immediately after the violations, but in many countries they work for decades towards that goal of prosecution. So those 2 principles apply. The approach should be holistic.
Yes.
And it should be sequenced according to your country's needs and context. Truth-seeking is, for many people, the most fundamental of those 4 pillars. Because if we don't know what's taken place, how can we know who should be prosecuted,
Yes.
who the victims are, what they should be assisted with, and what has caused this conflict? What are the root causes? What are the contributing factors?
Yes.
So we need, and in very many cases, where there's been a conflict, where there's been an authoritarian regime, they don't want the truth to be known. Very often journalists are denied access to places where violations are happening. In many countries, journalists are targeted for trying to uncover the truth. And so when you have a transition, one of the challenges is to uncover that truth. And my experience is that following a period of mass violations, nobody actually knows what's taking place. Somebody will say, I know, or we know what took place. We don't need to look at the truth, we already know. My experience is that's not true. That's not true. Some people may know what happened in one area or another area, or during one period or another period, but if there have been those crimes and if there's been that kind of hidden aspect, nobody really knows what's happened. And another thing that I've learned working on these mass crimes for 30 years is that they usually take place in darkness.
Yeah.
They take place when human beings are in situations where the lights are turned off, where there's no accountability, impunity in that darkness.
Yes.
That's where mass crimes take place. So the first thing we need to do is to uncover that truth, find out what's happened,
Right.
what kind of crimes have been committed, who was responsible,
Right.
who were the victims, what were the contributing factors? Was it local political situation, discrimination, religion, international actors? What were the root causes of that conflict? Because very often those root causes are still there.
Yeah.
And if we very many times a society will address the conflict or the mass violations and neglect the root causes, the discrimination, the lack of fairness in the way resources are contributed, corruption, misuse of natural resources, historical differences, and then the conflict or the violations will recur, often not in the same way.
Yes.
We may not know that. The same actors may be involved, and
Yes.
sometimes they change their clothes.
Yes.
They used to be in uniforms, then they're in suits and ties,
Yeah.
but they have the same methodologies.
Yeah.
So we need to look at and it takes a very courageous approach
Yes.
for a country to do that. It's very painful in
And
many
most
ways.
importantly, it helps them to heal.
It helps them to heal. Victims, I mean, we think just for a minute about victims of mass violations, rape, torture, killing. Who has failed them? The primary duty of any state is to protect its citizens.
Yes.
My country, everybody who belongs, who's lucky enough to have a citizenship of a country, the primary duty of our government is to protect us.
Yes.
In a situation where thousands of people have not been protected, then there's a failure of that duty.
Yes.
And so, according to international law, governments have a duty to repair that damage
Yes.
that's taken place. And the first step of that is to find out what happened.
Yes. What's the second step?
Well, the second step is actually, the first step is to realize that we need to undertake that process.
Yes.
And there are, the way I approach this when I'm teaching, and I often teach and help groups to strategize around what should be
Yes.
done. And the way I approach this is in terms of seeking the truth. There are two broad areas in which we can approach it.
Yes.
One is officially,
Yes.
and one is unofficially. And by that I mean relating to the government or the international organizations such as the United Nations. There are official truth-seeking approaches and mechanisms, and those which are undertaken by civil society, victims groups, academics and journalists. They're not non-official.
Yes.
So examples of official truth-seeking mechanisms, a famous one that has been done in many societies transitioning is often called a Truth and Reconciliation Commission,
Yeah.
or a Truth Commission, which is an official body established by a government with a mandate to look into all of the mass crimes that have taken place during a period, often during a period of decades.
Yes.
Now that's one official mechanism. There are many others, examples such as commissions of inquiry.
Yeah.
The difference between a commission of inquiry and a truth commission is that commissions of inquiry usually focus on a quite narrow area. For example, a massacre that had taken place, or a certain number of people who were targeted in a town or an area during a particular time. But a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is an exercise by a government to say, enough is enough. And for example, in East Timor, where I worked on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the CAVR, for 3 years,
Yeah.
the title of the final report was Jega,
Okay.
right? Enough.
Okay.
And that's the feeling of many societies when they come to that point. We've experienced the violations. It stopped. It started again. It stopped. It started again. It stopped. What do we need to do to get out of that? Because actually, if you look at societies where there's a continuous cycle of conflict or violations, they're never prosperous.
Yes, that's true.
They cannot establish the contributing factors to become prosperous.
Yes.
The development process, the legal process, the rule of law is disturbed by the conflict. Institutions become corrupted. There's large-scale corruption. There's a lack of transparency. All those things then undermine the ability to move forward. So, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, commissions of inquiry, inquiries by national human rights commissions, UN official fact-finding missions, commissions of inquiry. They're all official ways to seek the truth. Unofficially, there are many societies in which there are fantastic people dedicated to trying to make their country better and making the future of their country for everybody better.
Yes.
Civil society organizations dedicated to the truth, to justice, women's organizations, children's organizations, or youth, victims organizations.
Yes.
Journalists. So they're all, many of them are dedicated to finding out what the truth is.
Yes.
And journalists may undertake investigations. It's a very important part for a country to have an independent and highly professional media contingent that is able to operate freely and not under threat. Because if they can't investigate what's going wrong or who's stealing or who's, then how is the population going to know?
Yes.
So all of those things, academics work, university students inquiring, civil society.
Tribunals.
There have been in some cases where victims and civil society are frustrated because their governments have not moved forward on justice.
Yes.
Or other governments of countries that have been involved haven't moved forward. People set up, in some cases they call them tribunals, which are not really courts or tribunals, they're people's tribunals in which esteemed jurists will act in the role of judges, and others, well-respected jurists, will act as prosecutors and defense counsel. And this is like a moot court or not a real court. But they've been held. There was one on the terrible crimes committed during the Second World War under the banner of comfort women. Thousands of women from a number of countries used basically as prostitutes, without payment actually, forced to be raped by Japanese soldiers. So there was a People's Tribunal set up in Tokyo looking at that with women victims speaking out in public, filmed, telling of their experiences. Last year there was one in The Hague focusing on the violations in Indonesia in 1965. There's a famous one in where just one community decided they needed to look into their own history.
Greensboro.
In Greensboro, North Carolina, yes. A particular set of incidents involving the Ku Klux Klan. In their history, they felt needed to be uncovered, so they established a local commission to look into that, to do research, to hold public hearings, to try and bring up, uncover and clear that black part of their own community history. So there are many ways that we can seek the truth. And a large process like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission should take statements from all across the country, from a broad range of victims, mostly victims. If those who have been involved as perpetrators are willing to give information, that's also good, but often they don't. But experts, key actors, leaders, victims, all contribute to finding out what's actually taken place. And in many cases that goes back for decades. In the East Timor Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the CAVR, it looked back until 1974, and that was established in 2000, a little bit earlier than that. So looking at often 20 or 30 years of mass violations.
So let's move on to the next pillar, reparations.
Reparations, and a lot of people look at the word reparations and it's a bit confusing. And I always like to make things a little bit easier to remember. And if we look at the word reparations, it almost includes the whole of the word repair. And that's the goal of this part of the transitional justice framework, and that is to repair, to try to repair the lives of victims. Now, actually, that's a task that can never be achieved. You can't, when a victim has been raped or tortured,
not practical.
when their son or their wife or their father have been taken away and never heard of again, disappeared or killed, it's not possible to repair their lives.
Yes.
But we do what we can.
Okay.
And as I said before, governments owe that duty to the victims, so there's actually an obligation for governments to repair the damage that's been done because their duty to protect has lapsed.
Right.
And governments inherit the acts of the previous governments legally. So it's not the same people in the government, of course, that presided over. Sometimes it is the same people that are in the post-transition government that were part of the crimes, and sometimes not. But either way, the government owes the duty to those victims to try to repair their lives.
What are the different forms of reparations?
Well, there are different ways it can be approached. Again, officially or non-officially.
Okay.
The best is that if a government takes that duty very seriously. And I always believe that this is the best investment that a government can make, is to justice and establishing the rule of law, and we can talk about that, but also with truth and helping victims. Because after a conflict, when the relationships are torn and the divisions are deep and the hatred is deep, there may be peace and it may look like things are over. But if that hatred and that feeling of unfairness and resentment continues, then people will form groups again.
Yes.
They will eventually start the same kinds of attacks, the same kind of problems. Then there will be responses and the whole cycle would start again.
Yes.
That can be broken in a number of ways by addressing all the pillars that are recognized under transitional justice. But for example, where you have victims who feel they've been abandoned, neglected, not protected, sometimes we call it a government giving a message of care to those victims. Telling those victims, okay, you've suffered that, but this is a transition. We care about you now.
Yes.
We want you not to feel anymore like you're outside this unity of our nation. You're a very important part. We're going to try and repair what's been done. We're going to address those grievances you have about your rights. We're going to help with medical clinics and schools. And some forms, for example, reparations can include compensation to victims for the various harm that's been done. Restitution, which puts them back into...
What are some examples of doing
compensation can be done, for example, in terms of a monetary payment to victims who are victims, for example, of their child has been disappeared or killed or raped, or they've been raped or tortured. That can be done as a payment. It can be done through a pension. That's often a better way because the government doesn't have to pay so much initially, and it continues on. And poor people, and many victims are poor in every conflict. We find the wealthier people can keep themselves out of the conflict. It's not their children who are caught up, and often farmers and others who are just innocent bystanders are the victims of these conflicts. And so those reparations can be free medical care, they can include that for victims, pensions.
Could you give some examples where in countries?
Chile had a very, quite a good system whereby they've assisted in formal reparations for the victims of those violence. And there are a range of other countries who have undertaken that. Even
South
there've
Africa.
been South Africa has, and it's still trying to implement the recommendations of their Truth and Reconciliation Commission in terms of reparations for victims. Germany has undertaken massive reparations payment for what took place in the Second World War. Many countries have undertaken that. in Indonesia following the mass violence in Aceh and then the tsunami, which helped to create a situation where there could be a peace accord.
Yes.
There was a reparations policy for individual victims and communities.
Yeah.
Sometimes those are more successful than others, and one of the failings, sometimes what those implementing reparations programs forget is that victims don't only want money, and they often don't get very much.
Yeah.
I mean, they might get a few $100s here or there.
Yeah.
And they've lost their husband or their son, so they might get $1,000 or $2,000. I mean, we hope it should be much more than that. But they want to be recognized. They want people to acknowledge that they've suffered this harm. And one way we do that in the Truth and Reconciliations Commission is to say to them, we will record your story and it will be part of the national official history of what happened to you. And that is a small thing, but that's something which victims often value.
Yeah.
So we need to accompany the material assistance with acknowledgement to them. And if we only give acknowledgement without material assistance, that's also not enough.
Yeah.
Sure. And there are many ways victims need psychosocial help, they need medical help, they can't pay for their children to go to school, they've lost their husband who may be the major breadwinner, and conflicts always affect women.
Yeah. So basically that also includes integrating them into the mainstream society again.
That's right.
Yeah.
And those divisions which have taken place, they may have been labelled as part of one group or another group, and that may not be fair as well.
Yeah.
We find women victims of sexual violence often re-victimized over and over again because they were those who suffered these terrible experiences, dragged off, perhaps raped, and then sometimes their communities reject them because they were raped by a member of an opposition force.
Yeah.
Which the victim has no responsibility for that. They should actually be acknowledged as for their terrible suffering and as a contribution to they should be assisted and their lives helped to be repaired for that, not suffered again and again. And even when rapes have taken place and children have been born as a result, we find that people discriminate against the children, even though it had nothing to do with this.
Yeah.
So these are forms of discrimination that we need to address as part of the reparations approach.
Yeah. So let's move on to the third important pillar, right to justice. So what does it encompass?
The right to justice, I think we all acknowledge, is fundamentally important for our societies. Every nation has a very important part of its governance structure, which is the judicial system, the police, its criminal laws. So we acknowledge how important that is in our national system.
Yes.
We have laws that criminalize violent acts such as murders, assaults, rapes, all of those things in our national systems. Also criminalize corruption, criminalize white-collar crimes, all those things that we need for our society to operate successfully.
Yeah.
And we use the term the rule of law. Countries, and we find if we look at the levels of development and prosperity, how wealthy countries are, we find that the wealthy countries also have a corresponding high value of the rule of law. And what does the rule of law mean? The rule of law means that you have just laws that are equally applied to everybody. Many prosperous societies and well-established democracies have high levels of the rule of law, where if a very senior official up to the head of state or others are involved in crimes, corruption crimes, the legal apparatus will hold them to account in the same way as a poor farmer, or a teacher, or a mother, everybody in the country should be subjected, should have the same rights under the law.
Yeah.
And that's why we say the rule of law. The law is the ruler, not the law should be the king, not the king be the law. And what we find in many places are that there are lots of kings, small ones at the district level, the sub-district level, senior members of the government, police and others who are not subject to the laws in the same way that others are. And when you have a society where that takes place, it's very hard for the society to develop. Now, after a situation where mass crimes have been committed, you have a situation where, I mean, almost always, a major contributing factor to that has been impunity.
Yes.
If people are allowed to commit one murder and not held to account, then another one, and then another one, and another one. So when we find that there have been thousands of murders, killings, rape, torture, we always find that there's been impunity. If there's not impunity, if the first ones who commit those crimes are held to account, arrested and tried, the next ones actually won't take place. So impunity is the underlying contributing factor to mass crimes in almost all situations. And one of the things that the international community and many developed nations are recognizing now is that we must hold perpetrators to account for their crimes.
Yeah.
And if we don't, it's much more likely that they will repeat. And there is a movement internationally for international justice, because nations are vulnerable to localized influences. They have very powerful officials, armed groups, cronies, people with a lot of money, businesses, etc., who influence the rule of law, for whom the equal application of the laws doesn't exist. So sometimes countries find it very difficult to bring those citizens to account.
Yeah.
And the international community is now increasingly recognizing and supporting that they have a duty to assist as well, to ensure that, basically looking at when the worst crimes known to mankind have been committed, the perpetrators should be held to account. I mean, if somebody who's stolen a motorcycle or a car should be arrested and held to account, should we allow people who are responsible for murder not to be held to account? And sometimes national systems where it's very easily recognized that murders and rapes and should be arrested and tried. Yeah. But when there's a large-scale conflict or a authoritarian regime, thousands of those crimes, we just want to let them go. Yeah. That sends a message that there isn't the rule of law, that the law does not apply equally to everybody else. So in the transitional justice world and the framework, we're really looking at international crimes. We're not looking at the duties that governments owe to their citizens for the day-to-day crimes under the criminal justice system. Yeah. That's for each country to undertake. Yeah. But there have been the development of a few crimes which are recognized internationally.
Could you please tell us them in brief? Yeah.
Those crimes?
Yes, those crimes.
Okay. I mean, what has happened is, since the Second World War, the international community, governments, the United Nations, international jurists, and experts have gradually developed an agreement that certain crimes, if they are committed on this planet Earth, in any place, at any time, are crimes against international law. Yeah. And it doesn't matter if the national system recognizes them or not, they apply across the whole planet. Now, as I said, international law is not going to delve into national systems for small crimes, etc. And international law, in relation to these large crimes, in particular crimes against humanity, genocide, war crimes, and also torture, apply as international crimes all over the world. If a government, if those crimes are committed in a country and a government undertakes investigations and prosecutions of those responsible within its country, then generally there'll be no intervention by any international actors or under the jurisdiction of international law. But if those crimes are committed in a country against its own citizens or others, mass crimes, terrible crimes, and nothing is done to investigate and prosecute those responsible, now there are international legal obligations to bring those perpetrators to account. This is part of the international community's unsteady movement forward to a world in which mass crimes are no longer committed, in particular in relation to those who have the guns, usually, those who control mass weapons, because most of the mass crimes that we see involve those parties which have mass weapons.
Yeah, and these are crimes against their own
very
people,
often
civilians.
crimes against, and very often they're either crimes committed by agents of the state in one way or another, or they're crimes committed by others that the state doesn't investigate and prosecute for various reasons. That's also a violation of the state's obligation to prosecute.
Right, so let's move on to the last pillar, guarantees of non-occurrence. Would you like to explain that?
Sure. I think when we look at the transitional justice framework, and there are so many things that are possible to do, and we're using these 4 pillars: seeking the truth, prosecuting those most responsible, repairing the lives of victims. Those 3 things are backward looking in a transition, looking at what's happened. What's the truth about what happened? Let's bring it out, analyze it, share it, and use it to make recommendations of what to do. Let's prosecute those responsible for those past crimes so that in the future there won't be impunity, the crimes won't be committed again. Let's repair the lives of the victims in order to help reconciliation and the divisions and send a message of care to them. That's all about the past.
Yes.
But what we learn from those processes about why the violations have taken place, if we don't do anything about that, they will recur, very likely. So we need to reform. We need to look at all the different things that are necessary to reform so that they don't recur. And that 4th area, we can remember it under the umbrella of reform. Technically, and a technically more accurate term is guarantees of non-repetition, but it's a lot more difficult to say and to translate in many of the countries that I work in. But it means what reforms can we make, either to institutions or to a cultural identity, cultural practices as well. What things can be changed in order to remove those contributing factors that have caused conflict in the past and make it much less likely that they'll happen in the future. And
could you please give some examples from other countries?
Okay. In many places, conflict and mass violations have a root cause of a feeling of unfairness. I believe human beings need fairness like they need water and air. When a young child, my own children, others, when they barely can say their first words, they're things like, he got more cake than I did. She didn't have to do that, I did. And often when I look at that, I see that they're too young to have learned that behavior. It's actually something that I think we need as human beings. We need to feel that things are fair. And the other evidence for that is that it occurs across the entire planet in different ways, different formats, but we need to feel that something is fair. And when things are not fair, you think about yourself in the office, or when somebody is treated unfairly, it's like this thing inside. It's very disturbing for a human being. So what we find is that in many cases, minority groups, particular groups, have been treated unfairly because they're different to the majority.
Yeah.
And the majority either intentionally or very often through neglect have failed to recognize that these minorities have different needs.
Yes.
And have equal needs. And if we look at many of the places where there have been mass violations and conflict, if we map out what the socio-economic development is in those places, we see it's lower. Where there's a lot of the minority population living, the GDP or the measurement of economic development is lower than other provinces and other parts of the country.
Yes.
And I've seen that in so many countries, right? So even though a government may be saying we're going to treat everybody equally, if you look at the evidence, they haven't been treated equally. They feel an unfairness. Often they begin at a political campaign to have what their claims recognized. If that's not accepted, a small number of them might say it's time for us to resort to violence. And that happens. It's happened. I mean, we see that now in Thailand, in the Philippines. We've seen it in Indonesia, in Myanmar, in so many countries. And then, quite often, there's an overwhelmingly disproportionate response to that violence. And then the divisions are there, which go on and on and on. So in reform, we have to address the root causes. So if it's unfairness, if it's discrimination, we have to address that.
Okay.
If it's unfair laws, we have to address that. So for example, if it's impunity, which is a major contributor, we have to address that. So the kinds of reforms that are often brought in transitional contexts are legal and constitutional reform, for example, recognizing the equal rights of all the different people, and giving of rights through the applicable laws.
Yes.
There's a security sector reform. It's a very common part of the reform process because the security forces have often been involved. How is it that those security forces have become involved in mass violations? What was it? Was it because there was one of the international standards is that there should be civilian oversight of military and police, because we have found through experience that that's a balance that works better.
Yeah.
So very often the accountability mechanisms within security services are not high.
Yeah.
They look after their own in a way that denies what they've done. And that's I think it's unfortunate that that approach is taken because, for example, I often deal with military forces and police, and those fantastic men and women who work in those institutions and are committed to a high level of integrity and want to be respected and want their military forces and police to be respected by the population.
Yeah.
They're betrayed by those individuals who rape, kill innocent people unarmed, torture, etc. So it's wrong to assume that a whole group is bad or has been involved, and very often it's a minority. So it serves, that reform actually is something which can greatly benefit the members of the security forces as well, but often it's needed. Often there's been a breakdown of...
And it also helped to strengthen these institutions.
To strengthen them, to make them stronger, to give them a better basis of integrity, and to make the population proud of those institutions and deal with them as if they're friends and protectors. In many cases, they've been the opposite of that. So how do we reform so that we get to that point? And then the other reforms deal with the particular aspects of the conflict or the violations.
Okay.
In some cases, I worked immediately after the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, where 800,000 people were killed in 3 months with machetes.
Yeah.
And then another 300,000 were killed in the payback for that.
Right.
More than 1 million people killed in a very short period of time, not with bombs. And so it was a horrific situation. And one of the elements in that genocide was that the media, the radio stations in particular, had a very direct role in that.
Okay.
On a particular day, they broadcast a message all over the country, go out and kill the cockroaches.
Mm-hmm.
And that term, cockroaches, had been applied to the Tutsi tribe in a way that's very often a precursor to genocide in other places, a dehumanization of a group. Labeling them, criticizing them, pushing hate speech and other methods that lead to a feeling that they're less than human. That's a very common step which precludes genocide. So if we can recognize that those precursors are taking place, that dehumanization, and address that, we can intervene before these things take place. So in Rwanda, the media needed to be reformed.
Yeah.
In some places, the churches had a role. Religious institutions, they need to be reformed. And transitional justice practitioners are now also, when we're looking at guarantees of non-repetition, we might think that there are cultural, societal norms, feelings between groups that are contributing factors, and we should address those. So it can be reform of the security sector, laws, the judiciary, if it's, and in authoritarian regimes, one of the things that dictators and authoritarian regimes very often do is they break the judiciary.
Yeah.
How do they break it? They make the judiciary corrupt and agents of their political will.
Yeah.
So that then...
Not independent.
Not independent. Not making decisions based on the law and the facts, but making decisions based on what their political masters want or how much they're paid.
Yeah.
And then what we find is it's incredibly difficult to repair that once it's been broken or damaged. It's a terrible thing because with a broken legal system and a lack of rule of law, as I said earlier, very difficult to prosper and to bring your population to a high level of prosperity and justice and an open society. So the reform often extends to the police, the military, the judiciary, the media, perhaps schools. The children should know what happened. If they're going to be able to build a society in which it doesn't happen again, they need to know, even if it's painful, what really happened.
Yeah.
Historical narratives are often distorted, and we see that now. We see people publishing about the World War II that actually the Nazis didn't persecute the Jews. We hear people in Cambodia saying the Khmer Rouge didn't commit those crimes. So sometimes these narratives are manipulated and changed, and that also prevents us from facing the truth and moving forward. Every country has painful truths. My own country, Australia, has very painful truths about the way we have treated our Aboriginal population, for example. We need to face those painful truths. We need to look at accountability, at truth, at repairing the lives of the victims and reform about those issues. The United States has its own issues. Every single country has its own issues to look at. That doesn't mean that we all shouldn't do it. It means we all should do it.
Yeah. Well, that was very informative. And so today we identified what is transitional justice and the 4 pillars of it. And would you like to continue with this session later on?
Yeah, it's very hard to say no to you, so I don't.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Patrick.
No problem.
Okay. So dear friends, we hope you got a basic overview of transitional justice in this session. We hope that you will help spread the message to others going forward in our efforts to make a just and inclusive society. If you have any queries related to transitional justice, please write to us at help@knowyourrights.lk or send us a Facebook message so that we can address them in the coming programs. We will be meeting you soon again and discussing more on this topic. I'm Rajeevi Mapalagama, and thanks for joining with Know Your Rights.
For more information, visit us at www.knowyourrights.lk or visit our Facebook page, Know Your Rights SL, or email us at help@knowyourrights.lk.